To all of you, please be seated, and ladies and gentlemen, don't leave the room for an hour and a half at least, because what you're looking at up here is a super well-prepared panel. So what I'm about to do is to introduce you to the moderator of the panel, Stephen Ketteley, on my left. Look pleased and happy, Stephen. Yes. Stephen is one out of 4,000 lawyers in the very well-known international law company, DLA Piper, and your office is based in London. But looking at the 4,000 other lawyers, I chose Stephen because he's the best for this. So Stephen has around 10 years of experience advising gaming operators, and also very lately being involved in advising one of the very big players out there, stakeholders within the gambling world. So Stephen knows what he's doing, and for the last, half year, I would say, he's been concentrating on only one thing: preparing the panel for you today. Right? Yes? So all of them up here have been up very early. They had to meet for breakfast also to coordinate even more what they're doing today. So please give them a hand of applause. And I give the word to our moderator, Stephen Ketteley. Welcome.
We'll see how loud the applause are at the end as to whether it's been a successful panel. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to moderate this panel. These guys have all prepared very well for this. It's a very interesting topic, and one of the hot topics, I think, as a number of you will understand. I'm a lawyer. You all regulators, there are a few lawyers and regulators here. Law and regulation kind of go hand in hand in this sector, and in fact the law tends to drive our client strategies, tends to drive the direction of travel within the industry. And for those of you that are lawyers, the legal side of gaming is particularly interesting. It's a very interesting academic position for a lawyer to be within the sector. And I've advised a number of years on what I think some of you will call the black market, some of you I would like to call the grey market, which from a legal point of view has been very, very interesting. But that kind of work is gradually dwindling away. What's the real focus at the moment for lots of people is this social gaming debate. The reason why I mention law and regulation is because it's an area where law and regulation go hand in hand. And as I think this panel will demonstrate, it really goes to the very core, the question around whether or not social gaming, whatever that is, and we'll discuss what that means, should or shouldn't be regulated, goes to the very core of what regulation is for and why we actually regulate anything. We've got a fantastic panel here with a real diversity of interests and expertise. I'm not going to go through each of their bios. You've got those in the book, so you can read those. But I just want to just quickly introduce by name and a sentence about each of them so you understand their position within this debate and why they're here. So going from your left to right, we have Nicholas, who is one of the leading experts in the social gaming, on the legal side of social gaming. And for those of you that are interested in this subject, I strongly recommend you read the book that he and his colleagues at Branton Talosh have published recently. Thomas from Facebook, obviously one of the big distributors or platform providers, depending on your point of view. We'll see whether they are a distributor or a platform provider or agnostic. That'll be discussed. Keith is a problem gambling expert from the US, very well versed in the issues of addiction and problem gambling in the real money gambling environment. And Keith is here to discuss how relevant, if at all, such issues are to the world of social gaming. Raf is one of the leading developers of social gaming products in the world, and he'll blush, but it's true. And Stuart, last but not least, is a lawyer like me by background, but spends much of his time these days working with the leading or the only pressure group, lobbyist, trade body for the social gaming industry, which is the International Social Gaming Association. So there's the panel where I think we're set. So I'm going to hand over to Thomas initially, who is going to give you a few words about Facebook's role within this environment.
So thank you very much for that kind introduction, and also thank you so much for allowing Facebook to come here today and talk about this important topic. Just very, very shortly about myself. My name is Thomas Meyrup, and I'm based in Facebook's office in Stockholm, where I'm the Director of Policy for the Nordic region. So I actually consider Norway as my home as well. I have worked for IT companies for a while, but before that I was actually a regulator myself, not of gambling though. I want to start today by just saying a few words about gaming on Facebook and games on Facebook. I want to say a little bit about real money gambling, where actual payouts of money is involved, and then a little bit about what the future holds from a Facebook perspective, what we are planning to do. Why games and Facebook? And I think it's important to say before we begin that Facebook isn't first and foremost a platform for playing games. We are a social network, but naturally games fit very well with being a social platform. People have always wanted to connect with others through games and play games together. And our mission statement, make the world more open and connected, naturally fits very well with that. Games are global, they help people connect across cultural borders and so forth. So they are a natural fit. But I think it's important to say that most people really don't come to Facebook for the games. That's an added thing that comes at a later stage. We have on Facebook about 250 million people that play games every month. That's about a quarter of our total monthly active user base, as we call it, which is about 1.2 billion active users. But about 250 million people play games on Facebook every month. They like that. That's great for us. We want to facilitate it also because naturally it drives revenue for Facebook. About 20% of Facebook's revenues actually comes from games. And naturally, again, we want to fulfill our mission statement of making the world more open and connected, also when it comes to games. Games on Facebook hasn't always been the same thing. If we go back a few years, most people were probably interested in playing games like Farmville, farming games, build your own farm, get the latest tractor, city building, or maybe having your own restaurant and cooking up dishes and so forth. The games constantly evolve, and about a year or maybe a little bit more ago we saw social casino games and puzzle games like Candy Crush, typical one, and a very big one, take off on the site. And now the latest trend that we're really seeing are more what some people call hardcore games, shoot 'em up games that you see also sometimes on real game boxes that you attach to your TV, or hidden object games like Criminal Case, where you have to go and solve a criminal mystery and find the clues and figure out what they mean. So the ecosystem of games that we see on Facebook is continually evolving. It doesn't mean that the other games are dying out. It just means that there are a diversity of games that's getting bigger and more choice, and we think that's great for the people who use Facebook. A feature that we added late last year was what's called real money gaming. It's important to say that the games I talked about up until now were games where you could not win any money at the end. There's no payout from the game. But late last year, we decided that we wanted to change that, and the first real money games were allowed to use Facebook as a platform. Before that, we allowed those games or game operators to have gambling ads and pages on Facebook if they were licensed in their local community. It's important to say that there are a number of restrictions in place for real money games on Facebook. One important one being at the moment that it's only available in the UK. We are looking at other markets, of course, but right now it's in the UK. There are restrictions in place on who can see that sort of gambling. You must be 18. The operator of the game must know their customer and ensure that they're above 18 by verifying credit card information. There are IP restrictions in place, which means that this sort of activity only can be seen and accessed in the UK. And there are restrictions on who actually see what goes on in a game. For example, if I were in the UK and I was playing one of these games, that some of that activity might be seen in my newsfeed, but only in the UK and only to people that are above the age of 18. So there's a number of restrictions around who can see that sort of content. We think these games naturally will continue to evolve on Facebook. There will be new games coming up. I'm not an expert on what the next hit will be. Maybe there will be others in this panel that knows. But there will surely be new games. One trend that we increasingly see is that it's becoming increasingly interesting to create games that work across platforms. So first step is that the game is available on different platforms, but actually they also work together. And maybe potentially that one person is accessing a game from an Xbox below their TV, and another one is accessing it on their phone through Facebook. This sort of cross-platform, play anywhere sort of approach we think is going to be even bigger. And naturally, there will be other markets where real money gambling will be interesting, and we want to explore whether that's something that's possible for us to do in the future. When we do that, we definitely want to do it in collaboration with regulators. We, as I mentioned, want to make sure that the people who operate these games are doing it in a proper way, that they are licensed. We check their licenses, both if it's for real money gambling, but also if it's for creating a page or advertising on Facebook. We will ask them and check whether they're licensed. And naturally, we want to have an open dialogue and discussion about how to do this in the future. And part of that is being here today. I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Thomas. Thanks very much. There was a key phrase that Thomas mentioned in his talk, which we will keep coming back to, I think, today, which was, and there are various ways to say this, but I'm going to read it straight out from what Thomas said. There is no payout from these games. It's a very important phrase, and one that I think Nicholas may well be focusing on in his session now. So over to Nicholas.
Thank you, Steve, and I think I can actually directly relate to a lot of what Thomas just said and told us about gaming and gambling on Facebook. And maybe for those of you who have not heard that much about this topic, about this issue, maybe also touch on some of the basics. Thomas, you also showed us a number, one that we also heard at the very beginning of this day today. I'm showing you another number, and that is that altogether, worldwide, more than 750 million people are engaged in playing games on social networks. Now, that is not only on Facebook. To put that into perspective, I've looked at a few other markets, and I would like to compare these other markets to the social gaming market. So, the worldwide turnover of social gaming is $8.2 billion. That is very similar to the worldwide turnover of small arms, a very related sector, $8.5 billion. Amazon Germany's turnover, also Amazon was already part of today's presentations, $8.7 billion. Looking at a more traditional sector, the real offline toy market in the States, $22 billion, a little bit more. And Malta's GDP is also in that range, $8.7 billion, just to set that into perspective. Okay, I promised Steve to talk about the definition of social gaming, because wherever you go, people tend to be unsure what we are actually talking about when we are saying social gaming. So what is that? The definition I'm using is a game with freemium access. So true, it means that you don't have to pay to access the game at first and to play the game, but there might be possibilities to spend some money for premium content, for extra levels, new characters, you just name it. So free and premium makes the freemium access. However, the rewards you get out of the game will always be only symbolic. So there is no monetary cash out in these games. The games are played via a social network account that already exists, so it's what we call the single sign-on process. And the games use the social graph for various reasons. For instance, as we also heard, showing other users what I'm playing. Or if I have been inactive for a considerable amount of time, like half an hour, not having cashed in my daily bonus, my iPhone will send me a push message and I will be reminded to go back and play this game. The social graph, this is what it looks like. Facebook, I hope I am citing you correctly, says it is people and the connections they have to everything they care about. So in principle, it's the user himself. It is all the relationships you have on Facebook. It is things you might have looked at, bought, shared, liked, and done in the past, which allows you or which allows an operator to make predictions for the future. So using these buttons like share and like and add are a very core point, a very core issue in the social graph. We've also already looked at the different kinds, the different genres of social games that are around, a full variety of games ranging from card games and simulation games up to the games that look like real money casino games, but maybe are not. But we have the casino genre right here. And there is one big difference, and I would like to show you this difference now. Thomas already touched on Facebook looking into real money gambling, and they did so first with Bingo Frenzy. I'm going to cut this short because we already heard about it, so it's a real money game. The difference is that there is no single sign-on process here, so I have my extra KYC checks, I have the age limit that is 18 years and not 13 years like for an ordinary Facebook account, and I will have age and identity checks here. You see, there are jackpots here. This is shown in British pounds because it's, as we heard, only available in Great Britain. I tried to access Bingo Frenzy last week from my computer in Austria. I got this warning sign that I can't do that because the game is available only in Britain. So, looking at Bingo Frenzy and doing this definition thing, asking myself whether this is real money gambling or whether it is social gaming, I have to look at the elements that constitute gambling in the respective jurisdiction. Steve, you mentioned the book we have done, and in the course of research for this book we looked at various jurisdictions. And there might be this and that element in different countries, but down to the bottom line it is these three elements that that a game must fulfill in order to be a real money gambling game. That is chance, a game, the result of a game depending predominantly or exclusively on chance, the consideration a player has to pay in order to take part in the game, and the price of monetary value to be won. Looking at Bingo Frenzy, all these three elements have been fulfilled, and that's where we could make a full stop, because this game is a real money game. It is gambling and therefore caught by gambling legislation in the respective jurisdiction. And we can take this game further. For instance, looking at a pinball machine, we all know them from bars. Nobody would ever think of qualifying them as a gambling game, like a slot machine, for instance. We all know there's consideration going into that game in order to let me play this pinball game, but the user will always know that there is only entertainment coming out of the game. So there is no price of monetary value to be won. Looking at a game like Zynga Poker, again, undoubtedly there is consideration going in, but the only thing you can get out of Zynga Poker is entertainment. Again, no price of monetary value that I will get out as a user here. Why is that? And just to try to illustrate the definition of social games I gave you, because poker is probably the best example for two players transferring some kind of in-game currency, maybe also virtual goods, like for instance a virtual beer mug that I might have placed beside my poker table. There is one in-game account here with in-game currency. Let's not talk about the virtual goods now, and then let's say there's Steve's account on the other side. And now maybe Steve is not as good a poker player as I am, and then he asks me to give him some additional currency so that he can continue playing. So there is the exchange of virtual currency within the game between these two accounts, but looking outside of the game, there will not be any exchange going out, because that would be a knockout criteria for qualifying a game as a social game. So no money goes out here. One of the constitutive elements has not been fulfilled, and therefore real money gambling legislation generally will not apply. Looking at the different genres and looking at what these games really feel like and what the design of these games are, you all probably know one of Zynga's most successful simulation games, Farmville. Well, what they did is they created a slot machine with all those cute little ponies and apples and oranges and pears. And of course, you could find a similar looking game with any real money gambling operator. What Zynga also did is that they created this slot machine for the UK market. And now have a look at the left-hand side and the right-hand side at the bottom. On the left-hand side, I'll just remove this one more time so that you can see it better. On the left-hand side, you've got 6 credits, 6 points, and on the right-hand side, you've got the credit of 30 pence. So this goes to show it doesn't really matter what the looks and the feels of the game are. It is always the elements that you have to look at when determining whether a game is a social game or it is real money gambling. So that means that even those games that really look like real money gambling will not be gambling if one of those elements, and it is mostly the element of price, is not fulfilled. These are, by the way, the member states of the European Union we looked at in the course of research for our book. Okay, so again my question, why are we here? Where is the risk if this is not real money gambling? Well, we know there is no money going out, but there is money going into the game. Okay, who is actually playing social games? We've looked at the average player of social games. And looking at what I've put on my slide there, there's probably not that much of a risk there, don't you think? Because it is that 40-year-old American woman playing maybe an hour or even less a day and spending under $1. So who really cares about that? But, and probably Raf will also be able to touch upon that later on, if you look at specific games, we have learned that they can target different customer groups very precisely. Let's start with the gender. On the left-hand side, you've got Top 11. This is a game in which you can manage your own soccer team. We've got 90% of players who are male. On the other hand, on the other side, we've got Mall World, where you can manage your own fashion boutique. Well, 95%, yes, 95% of all players are female. So on the one hand, this shows us that more females are interested in soccer than males are interested in fashion, but it also shows us that an operator can target the group he or she wants to address very, very, very precisely. We've did the same thing with the player age. Again, top 11. We've got 90% of players who are under the age of 36. On the other hand, Slotomania, a very popular slot machine game, we've got 68% of players who are 36 or above. So again, a very, very different range of age groups. The question remains, what kind of regulation do I need? I want to once more summarize. If it is real money gambling, it is caught by real money gambling legislation with all that comes with it. If it's not, the question is, do we have legislation that is already applicable to social gaming? I'm restricting myself to the EU, and there I can say yes, we have secondary EU law that is applicable. We have a variety of directives covering social gaming that surprisingly do not apply to real money gambling due to express exclusions from the scope of applicability of these directives, but they do apply to social gaming. I've picked one just to touch upon that, the Consumer Rights Directive. That obliges an operator to inform customers about himself, about the product, before the client, the user, actually enters into a contract. And then we've got the button, which needs to be implemented. And this button shall serve for users to see that when they click this button, they will be obliged to pay, because they are entering into a contract which they will have to pay for. So what are the issues that actually remain? Because on the one hand, it's not gambling. On the other hand, we have legislation that already applies. But there are risks. Yes, there are risks. Overspending is one risk. Very often this is referred to microtransactions, because there are these small amounts of money that you can buy content for in the game, in-app purchases. And the other one, which normally attracts gambling regulators, is the grooming argument that a social game might be the funnel to real money gambling. Let's see what there's to be said about these two risks. Whom do we have to protect? Of course, it is the consumer, and here, of course, the vulnerable consumers like minors in the forefront. I'd like to come to my last stop here, and that is looking at the monetization models of social gaming. Because remember that figure of 750 million people I showed you? Well, of this total figure of players of social games, we've got only between 1% and 5% of players who, within the freemium model, you remember you can play for free, but to get premium content you will have to pay, or you might be required to pay. Only 1% to 5% of players actually pay real money. And of this small group, again, only 15% bring the operators more than half of the revenues. That's what we call the whales, and that's something that is very similar to online gambling. But the interesting part here is that only a very, very small group of players actually ever play for real money. Let's get back to the in-game purchases and the overspending issue. Microtransactions is the buzzword. Candy Crush, I'm sure it's a game known to a lot of people in here. This charm of stripes that you can buy costs $40. Let's leave it at that if that's a microtransaction. And then I'll share my favorite story with you, and that's the story of good old Danny Kitchen. Well, he wasn't that old, actually. He was 5 years old, and he was playing Zombies vs. Ninjas. And while he wanted to get rid of these evil zombies, he also got rid of $2,500 on his dad's credit card via in-game purchases. Because these in-game purchases cost, well, up to over $100. So again, microtransactions, question mark. This shall show you that it's not only the gambling genre social games that we must be concerned about, because there are risks that are also inherent to other games. Now, what does overspending do? I'm sure Keith can be much more eloquent on this, but just a few thoughts from my side. The concept of value is something minors mostly do not understand, and how should they be able to understand that? Then, also games that do not look like real money gambling games use gambling mechanics, be it an RNG or any other mechanic that is normally used in the gambling field. And they all trigger this need for instant rewards. Just the other day, I read an article about children who used to love waiting for Christmas. Now it is not about waiting. Now it is about getting your instant reward now, right now, wherever I am, whenever I want to. So the long-term impulse control is not really educated through these games. And this, as I said, is true for all genres and not only the gambling genre. The question I would like to ask, and I'm sure this is also a question for the panel, is this really an issue for gambling regulators, or is this not much more an issue of consumer protection, of fair competition, of general e-commerce that maybe other authorities would also be obliged to look at? Grooming, the other issue that I've identified, a lot of what I've said about overspending is true as well. The gambling genre, what are the special risks here? Well, there's the risk that an RNG might pay out, a slot machine might pay out 100% or 120%, not very realistic when I look at a real money gambling machine. So it is all about transparent information. Therefore, again, my question, is this really a topic for the gambling regulator? So summing this up, I think the industry would be well advised to inform their customers transparently, and this is actually one of the main issues the British Office of Fair Trading also addressed in its report that was issued just a few days ago. Transparent information may be ultimately resulting in industry standards implemented by the industry, and then, of course, as a different set of topics, enforcement of already existing legislation that we all know about. However, whichever step should be taken in the future, it must be based on evidence, because only then we can get a regulatory framework that will serve all stakeholders well, from the industry to the player and, of course, the states as regulators. Ready to discuss this. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. So that's helping to continue to set the scene. This consideration, prize and chance point always comes up when you're looking at these games all across the world, and there is a consistency. There are these quirks out there. The UK has this kind of odd rule that you don't even need to stake something for it to be a game of chance. But generally the rule across jurisdictions, and I'd be interested to hear people's views from the variety of jurisdictions around the world as to whether you again use that same model of the three limbs in order to make something gambling. But you always left at the end about this definition of prize and what is a prize. And if I can't extract any money out of this environment, then that moves it away from the gambling regulator and leaves it in the limbo potentially that you're talking about. So the question is, how do we define a prize? Anyway, so we'll come on to that a bit later. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Keith, who's going to give you a bit of a view on some of the concerns from the problem gambling expertise around these particular types of game.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you very much to IAGR and the conference organizers for having us here. Nicholas, you did an excellent job on covering a lot of my points, so I'll be really brief so we can get to the panel, because I believe the panel is where we're really going to have some great discussion. Just a little bit about the National Council. We are the U.S. NGO on gambling addiction. We were founded in 1972, so we have over 40 years of experience working with all the stakeholders and bringing all the stakeholders together, not just operators, but regulators, legislators, and obviously the health-based advocates for problem gambling. I have been working on gambling issues now for 18 years, and over the last several years, I've been focusing a lot on social gaming. Unlike in the European Union, there are very few U.S. laws that will seem to do consumer protection in a way. So I think in the United States, we face a little bit more difficulty with social gambling because our consumer protection system is not as rigid or as robust as you have in Europe. So why should we care about social gambling? Very briefly, from the gambling, so our experience comes from the gambling standpoint, not from games or entertainment, but from the gambling standpoint. We know that video gaming and social gaming, we know that video gaming and games are correlated with gambling in youth. So youth that are more likely to engage in games are more likely to engage in gambling as well. We know that early onset of gambling is associated with problem gambling. Very simply put, in the United States, the earlier a child starts to gamble, the more likely they are to have a gambling problem. So age of onset, just as with tobacco and alcohol use, is a clinical determinant of addiction. It's not that every kid that starts early is going to become an addict. It's just that the earlier they start, the more likely they are. Even though we understand most kids and most people who engage in gambling, 95% plus or minus, will never develop a problem. But the earlier you start, the more likely you are. And some of the social gambling mechanics, some of the features that you've heard about a little bit and you'll hear about more, are associated with addiction in the real money world. So things like the opaqueness of play, high speed of play, high frequency of play, so the amount you can bet, if you will. These are all known to be associated with addiction in other forms of gambling, and so we hypothesize or we assume or we fear that they might have an impact in the social world as well. In the United States, at least, there is no oversight. There are very few applicable laws to this, so we think it creates a void that is being filled rapidly, and therefore, even just from a precautionary principle, we think it's important to engage with operators and regulators. And if you look at the numbers that we've given, and you assume that in the general population, if 1% of adults meet criteria for a severe gambling problem, that's still roughly 2.5 million people, monthly average users, that would be expected to have a gambling problem. Now, I would probably submit that if you were a problem gambler, you might be more likely to engage in social gambling, just as you are more likely to engage in all other forms of gambling. That's a testable, it's an untested but a testable proposition. I think my second point is that there's a big fear in the operator side, which is legitimate, of course, that regulation is going to kill social gambling. The National Council on Problem Gambling is not calling for regulation of social gambling. We are calling for consumer protection standards. We would much rather, ironically, to an audience of regulators, we would much rather, as a private NGO, work with the operators to devise consumer protection standards rather than have them be imposed. But I think that implicit prospect of regulation may bring the operators to the table, and obviously, voluntary regulations have to be backstopped by some enforceable commitment from a gaming regulator. And we know that over the last 40 years, this model has worked reasonably well in the United States, that it has often been an NGO like ourselves and the operators coming together with a plan that is going to narrowly tailor the regulations at those who need the most protection, while leaving those who do not with the ability to gamble as they see fit. We believe it protects operators, most importantly, it protects consumers, and that responsible gaming or consumer protection, call it what you will, has allowed this industry to flourish. It's flourished because of regulators. It's flourished because of responsible gaming. And so I think this is an opportunity, especially for legalized, regulated gambling companies who now move into the social space. They have the most experience and the most to benefit from consumer protection or responsible gaming in this space. So, as I said earlier, we call for voluntary self-consumer protection, if you will, voluntary self-regulation, I guess is the term of art. We have pioneered the draft of the first ever consumer protection standards for social gaming. We're happy to make that available, but the acronym is GRADE, G-R-A-D-E. We want to focus on, the G is for gambling-related games. We're less concerned with Candy Crush and more concerned with Zynga Poker. The more gambling-related a game is in theme, appearance, and mechanics, the more we believe there's need for consumer protection. R is responsible gaming features. While, again, real money gaming has and should have a full suite of responsible gaming features, social gaming, I think, has less risk, and therefore the features can be reduced. But it's still important to have, for example, ability for a player to exclude themselves. Age controls. And that's the third feature of grade A. There needs to be, we need to have a social, societal conversation on what that age should be, but if there is a minimum age, it should be enforceable. There should be attempts made, perhaps maybe not at point of entry, but at point of consumption, at monetization, which is only going to affect between 1% and 5% of social gamers. At the point of monetization, when you're collecting information anyways on their means of payment, that might be a very good time to try and enforce a minimum age. D is for data-driven research. We couldn't agree more that this must be based empirically, but that does not mean, of course, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And especially as regulators, you know that sometimes we have to be ahead of the curve. I mean, I'm pleased that we're having these sorts of conversations now. We're actively engaging with the International Social Games Coalition. I know Raf will tell you about some of the research they're doing. So yes, it must be data-driven. And the internet, of course, offers more potential for data collection. Every transaction is tracked, and we know that there's a lot we can do already with internet gambling data. Last but not least, the E in grade is creation of an informed consumer. I believe that the internet, whether it's online gaming, real money gambling, social gaming, offers a lot more ability to engage with consumers and help educate them in fun and exciting ways. I mean, think about if we use some of the means that we incentivize players right now on social gaming, what if we use them to incentivize responsible gaming behavior? What if you got 500 free coins for clicking through a brief slideshow on helping you set your own limit? You know, what if we can have leaderboards for people that have done all sorts of responsible gaming, little quizzes and tests? I think there are ways to make this fun and exciting. Your responsible gaming and gambling addiction shouldn't always be this just horrible conversation that everybody shies away from. I think we have the opportunity with social gaming to work together to create things that can be fun and attractive and exciting, but also minimize the risk. So with that, I will leave you to the panel, and thank you very much.
Okay, that's the end of the formal presentations, and as Birgitte said, you're not allowed to move, even though we've got a bit of a long journey, so as a parent of young children, I feel like maybe we'll have a comfort break. But anyway, now we haven't heard from Raf and we haven't heard from Stuart yet, and I want to begin the panel by turning over to you guys, because we've heard some excellent presentations which really helped set the scene for this debate. Each of the three presenters have presented different areas of interest and concern to the regulatory community. What I would like to speak to you both about is the International Social Gaming Association, which has come together, a number of the leading developers in this space. On your website, it says the primary purpose, I think is to explain to the gaming regulatory community about your industry, how it works. So now is your opportunity. What I'd really like you to try and Raf, we've talked about this already, I'd really like to try and explain to some of the delegates who are perhaps less familiar with your kind of product, how you build them, who you're building them for, how you're distributing them, and just explain a bit more about what it is you actually do.
Okay, I'll just start by talking in general terms from an association point of view, then I'll pass over to Raf to talk about his company. But what we need to understand is this is a new genre of entertainment. It's fast growing, it's constantly changing, where the consumer wants content on demand, they want premium content at little to no cost, they want to access it from multi-platforms, whether it's Facebook, website, apps, they want to play it on multi-devices, whether it's mobile phones, laptops, PCs, TVs, glasses, watches, whatever's going to come next. And the pursuit is driven by personal achievement and social interaction. Now, this is a new consumer. It's got characteristics from video gaming, it's got characteristics to some extent with the casino-style games to online gambling, it's got characteristics to the film industry. So what we want to achieve is a dialogue with relevant stakeholders, whether it's regulators, policymakers, consumers, consumer protection groups, to make sure that these groups don't apply traditional understandings to different industries, to what is a new and pretty much unknown industry. And I agree with a lot that has been said. We have, as an industry, a responsibility to the consumer, and we have a responsibility to the operators. And I think it's wrong to try and jump in and apply new regulation to what is an unknown. I fully support getting more research, but at the same time, I fully support Keith's point that there's a lot of things that can be done now at relatively low cost and less burden to the operators that can add additional protections to the consumer. And from our association's point of view, all of our members support that.
Now, I'm going to get on to that in a minute about what more or what you could do, and that's relevant to a number of people in the panel. But before we do, so Raf, you could explain a bit about the sorcery of your business.
Sure. Also, just before we start, no horns, no hooves. I don't think we're that evil. So we are Plumbee. We are one of, I think we're probably top 10 player, startup based in London. We have about 50 people working for us, and we make social, free-to-play casino games. We have one game on Facebook called Mirrorball Slots, which is, as you can imagine, a slots game. We have the same game also live on iPhone and iPad, and working on Android versions as well. We have about 300,000 daily active users and about 1.5 million monthly active users. The way this works, obviously we all talk about free-to-play, freemium. The way this works is we have about 2.5% of those players who actually spend money, so 97.5% never give us any money. But basically it's a volume game. 2.5% of 1.5 million people, that's still a lot of people, that's 35,000 people. They spend in average $10 to $15 per week, which basically combined means that it's quite a meaningful amount of money. It's about $1.5–2 million per month for us, which we use then to spend on marketing, pay salaries, pay the rent for the office, etc. So that's the business model. In terms of the users, the players, has been mentioned before. The average user for our game, our slots game, is a 52-year-old, female, skews heavily female. About 70% of our users are women. 50–55% North America, US and Canada. About 10% Australia, New Zealand. 20-ish% Europe, and the rest from all over the world, Asia, South America. Very diverse. Some of those people played slots games before. I think there's actually more an overlap with the land-based casino audience than it is with online casino. I think the people playing the social casino games on Facebook or on mobile or tablets are more entertainment seekers, because obviously you cannot win any money with it. So you basically, what you can win is more time, more fun, which is kind of also what you see with people visiting land-based casinos, where there's more like an entertainment mix. There's restaurants and bars and nightclubs and so on. People go there not just to gamble, where online gambling tends to be a bit more skewed towards gambling and only gambling. It's a very young industry, and that's also something I think we should not forget. I think we are definitely very open, talking with you guys, talking with other organizations to see what we can do better. But I think one thing we should not forget is this is a very new industry. Social games in general and social casino as a subset of that is 2–2.5 years old. I would warn also that it might be a little bit unrealistic to expect that a young new industry suddenly can have the same level of compliance, the same level of regulation than mature industries like real money gambling. So I think everybody, all the major operators, all the major developers are very keen to see what we can do better, where we can take away some of the concerns there might be, where we have to spend a bit of time and money to investigate, do more research. But I think we have to also be realistic that any new industry will take some time to figure out. It's also to figure out what is a problem, what is not a problem. Right now, I think a lot of the concerns that exist are sometimes based on anecdotal data. For example, in our case, we have shared actually some of our data with the UK Gambling Commission as part of their research. We have less than 1% of our players are under 18. So for us, the concern of underage players, we don't really see the data. And also when I talk with some of our colleagues, they see the same numbers. So from our point of view, based on our data, we don't think that's a major concern. So I think we have to be careful that we don't jump to conclusions based on someone's colleague whose 13-year-old daughter was playing this poker game. I think that's something we should be careful with.
Okay. Thank you. So, I mean, everyone's had a chance to speak now, and it's a long session. So before, I don't want to do questions right at the very, very end. So if anybody's got any questions they'd like to raise now in relation to what they've heard so far, please put your hand up, or we will carry on.
I would like to ask a question to Nicholas. Your last slide was about evidence. Yes. Question for Nicholas. Your last slide was about evidence-based. And knowing about what at least digital evidence means, I was not expecting that social gaming and your presentation was going to end by such a recommendation. So I would like to have some more comments about what you mean or what you meant by evidence-based.
Thank you. Well, evidence-based is the invitation for everyone who has the data and has the ability to validate and to look at that data to dig further into that field, because very often I think people are speaking about regulation, potential regulation, what is there to be done, and it's just assumptions. And it's okay to have the assumptions, but I guess the most important thing is to have your thesis and then validate, see if that's true, if these assumptions are correct, or if they prove to be wrong. And then, if they do prove to be wrong, then you'll be well advised to rethink your attempts into regulating whatever field it might be. This is not narrowed down to social gaming in one or the other way.
Yeah.
So what I think is important is to prevent some kind of over-regulation that will kill the industry, and then at the end of the day, when we look at what has been done, we come to the conclusion that actually we've regulated something that didn't need to be regulated in that way.
Yeah, I would make it a bit more specific, because we hear a lot of regulators and media and politicians with concerns about social games and social casino games specifically. And I think the risk is a little bit that everybody has their own concerns. There's a group of people say like it's all about underage players and what about the children. There's a group of people saying like there's people who are spending way too much money on this. There's people saying the concern is that people spend too much time on this. There's people say it's more a concern that we normalize gambling for a broader group of people. It's more a philosophical point. So I think we have to be careful that we don't shout for regulation without knowing exactly what we want to solve. What is the problem we want to solve? Like, I don't think you as a regulator should be worried about killing an industry. That's not your problem. Your problem is to make sure that you protect society, you protect vulnerable people. And if that means killing an industry because the industry is doing harm, then so be it, right? I think that's not something you should be worried about.
And it's not just about identifying the risks, it's then finding out which is the most appropriate body to regulate. Because, I mean, the casino genre of social gaming actually only represents about 20% of the entire market. So by having a set piece of regulation for such a small group, I think you're actually going to create a big black hole where people just run the same mechanics on different skinned games and you've solved nothing at that point. So it's about looking at the industry as a whole, identifying the risks. If there are risks, how severe are those risks? And then it's about building proportionate remedies to make sure those risks don't materialize.
I think most people probably sat up for the first time and looked at the social gaming industry when Caesars bought the first half of Playtika. You know, it was and you can't escape the fact that the International Social Gaming Association's a number of the members are IGT and GameSys and Caesars. You know, they are known as gaming companies, and to regulators around the world, they are known as gaming companies. Question I've got probably to Keith initially is it too easy a leap to make from something having cards and dice within a casino to something having cards and dice within the environment that Raf's been describing, and think, well, lots of the tests and issues that would arise in that environment automatically would apply just because it's the same type of game?
I mean, I think that is a good question. I think Nicholas's slide on grooming is relevant. And just on the previous point, I would say that I think regulators might have a great role in that transparency project, that collection of data. You know, holding. You know, you've provided information to the UK Gaming Commission. That regulators can provide a great service, and I think being that third party that can hold and protect and make sure that this data is de-identified, and then release it to qualified researchers. So I think there's a great role for the regulatory agencies in that. But yeah, in terms of the convergence and crossover, when we first all got into this, convergence was the big term. You know, our social gaming companies, you know, the impression was that these big gambling operators moved into social gaming as a means of converting this vast pool of online, internet, social gamblers, call it what you will, into their bricks and mortar operations. And I think we know so much now after 2 years. I mean, it doesn't seem like convergence is the big deal anymore. So I think from a recreational standpoint, convergence is not, I think these are separate pools of people to a greater or lesser extent. I think from the gambling addiction standpoint, the question's still out, but I suspect there is convergence. So I think it depends on the lens you're looking from. We look at that 1% lens, which is not representative of the market, but for the people we talk to, internet gambling isn't as they gamble on anything and everything, and this is something that they will probably use and misuse just as they use and misuse every other form of gambling. So our concern is, again, not the 99%, but the 1%. And how do we engineer? That's a different question. But
what about the 1% that are buying cherries or trees or cows? I mean, just because you're losing money on a gambling style game doesn't mean you should only regulate gambling style games. Yeah,
agreed. And I think that the potential for addiction, the nature of addiction is such that society has long held that gambling is separate and apart. So yeah, I mean, it's a good debate. We've had a struggle drawing a red line. Our draft standards say gambling like games. And we've got some text on that, but that's a term of art.
I mean,
that's not a legal
f-
definition.
Farmville is just a casino in disguise, isn't it? I mean, anyway, as a question, I think from the floor.
Following on from your very good slide, Nick, that showed the comparative economies, is there any empirical data out there yet as to how big a deal this is, how much moral danger there is, how much financial danger there is, compared to other things that you could get addicted to and spend money on or spend too much time on, like surfing, snowboarding, eating, consuming sugar, licking lollipops? How big a deal is this in social terms?
Can I buy you a beer after this?
I get addicted.
I don't know, maybe it's better for you, Keith,
Yeah.
to touch on that question, because I don't feel well enough informed about that to answer your question.
Yeah. Well, and again, we would say that especially for when you look at it from the gambling standpoint, from the gambling company's perspective, I think there is danger. I think there is moral hazard there. If you say one side of my operations, which is gambling-like, if poker, if it's social, Keith, you have no role whatsoever. It's not gambling, therefore addiction doesn't exist. And then on the other hand, you say the same game, if I offer it on an RMG site, then it's but how we draw that line, I think is very difficult. But I believe that the more we can do to mitigate harm in general. So I certainly can't speak for the food industry. I certainly had a delicious Napoleon for dessert. But the more we can mitigate risk, the better off we are. And so that's why our call for voluntary protection. So we're not saying that we know to work backwards. We can never eliminate gambling addiction. We can never eliminate the harm from gambling. All we can do is reduce it. And I believe we should do as much as we can to reduce it. Now that doesn't, so of course we can never reduce harm in any nature of life. We are risk takers, that's good. But the more we can do to reduce it costs little or nothing.
Can I just comment? I mean, I don't speak on behalf of Caesars, IGT, or Aristocrat, but I think, if anything, I think it's a good thing that gambling companies are broadening their scope and becoming more entertainment companies. I think we should all be happy that gambling companies are not just gambling, but they actually say, like, we actually have learned a lot. We're IGT, we have learned a lot about technology and great content and great fun games that engage all of users. We can use what we learned in a new industry, which is not gambling. We are Caesars, we learned a lot about how to make people happy, how to give people a really good time. So we're now going to use that and broaden our scope towards games. I think that's great, right? We shouldn't punish those companies because they broaden their scope and they're becoming broader entertainment companies.
I just want to talk about this evidence, because we hear a lot about evidence, the need for evidence, and the UK Gambling Commission's report says they need evidence, the Australian report says we need evidence. So the regulators are, to their credit, seeking evidence. They want to learn about how these games work and how they interact with the players. One of the things that I struggle with, particularly around that so-called evidence, is your claim about only 1% are under 18, because you don't know that, right? Because the information that you're basing that on is the information that I believe, let's say it's within the Facebook game, ignore other stuff, within that platform is the information that you're given by Facebook, which in turn the player is given Facebook by the player, and it's not verified. I'd just like to come to Thomas about this and just want to understand the position of the distributors in the platform providers in this environment, because Raf and I have talked about this before, about age verification and the idea that someone in your business would age verify people because of the financial dynamics of these people and how little they spend, you wouldn't have a business. And I just wonder where Facebook, Apple, Google sit within your responsibilities as far as the developers are concerned and to your consumers.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think just to begin, I mean, it's really important that everybody just understands Facebook's role here. We do not create games at Facebook. We are a platform where others create games and use some of the features that are available on the Facebook site. For that, we get a cut of the in-game purchases, and that's where our sort of revenue comes in from this. And as I said in my introduction, that's about 20% of Facebook's revenues. But we are not a game creator, and we're not an expert on how games should look, what's appropriate for a certain age group. That's not really what we are experts at. We have on Facebook, as most of you probably know, an age limit of 13 years, which means to be on Facebook you must be 13. But and we have a number of things in place to ensure that age limit is respected. One thing we have, for example, is that when you sign up to Facebook, you are not asked how old are you, you're asked to provide your birth date. And if that birth date doesn't show you're above 13, you won't be allowed to create a profile on the website. And we will drop, as it's called, what's called a persistent cookie on your computer, notifying us that a person has entered a birth date here that's below 13, which means that the user shouldn't be allowed to create a profile on Facebook. So the classical thing that a user will do when they discover that they are not allowed to create a profile is that they will go back and try to change the birth date. That's not possible on Facebook because of the persistent cookie, and you have to have a certain level, at least, of technical understanding to bypass that system. Now, that doesn't mean that there are not people who do bypass our system, who do cheat our system, because there is, and we recognize that. We have different means for people to address that issue on the website. You can report to us that a user is under the age of 13. What will happen then is that we will challenge that person and say, hey, can you verify your age, please? And if the user cannot do that or will not do that, we will terminate their account from Facebook. So it's not a system, because there is sort of no universal way of verifying whether a person is above 13 or not. But it is a system that attempts to create that barrier, and we think we're fairly good at it.
I mean, there is a way of identifying people over 18, because all the gambling...
Over 18?
All the gambling companies...
I said 13.
You could talk about 13. I'm interested in the 16-year-old, for example. And the way, I mean, as Keith eloquently put, there is a school of thought in the study of addiction that if people are going to generate a problem, it's much more likely that they'll generate it younger. And I guess this is a question to Stuart. Sorry, let me finish.
Okay, go ahead.
Is one of the accusations that continues to be levelled at the social gaming business is you don't know how old these players are, so how can you possibly say that you're not targeting children? And I've heard some very good responses from you in the past about that. I'd like to understand from both businesses how you see it that way, how would you respond to that?
So I think first of all, I think there's two things. One is, if you're talking about age verification, there are a lot of businesses online and offline where that is a problem, right? I mean, I can go to Amazon and Amazon doesn't force me to prove that I'm old enough to buy a naughty movie or something. So that's one thing. I think it's very hard for most businesses to have age verification right. Secondly, while I personally think that it's probably not great for people under 18 or under 16 to play casino-style games, there is also an argument that says that you can play poker for matchsticks, and for example in the US that's very popular. Like kids actually play it with their parents. Poker is actually quite a fun card game apart from the gambling element. So there's a lot of people who say there is no reason why it should be 16 or 18, as long as people are responsible and they enjoy a fun game of cards, a game of poker, with no money involved. That should be totally fine. There's nobody that should limit the age or basically make it only for 18 plus people. So I think it's a very thin line. Like we had a lot of people in our industry, but also outside, who actually did say, like, when I was 14, I played poker for matchsticks with my dad, and that was great, and we had a lot of fun. And now suddenly, because it's online, it should all be 18 plus. I think it's tricky. We're still talking about video games, about games of entertainment. I don't really see the need to be so focused on the fact that people have to be 18. And lastly, I would say, if you look at the age that people tell us that they are on Facebook, and of course it's hard to know for sure, I would struggle to believe that if I'm 14 or 16 that I want to pretend like I'm 52 and have a picture of somebody who is 52. I don't think that's the cool thing to do. I would struggle to believe that that's a large-scale problem. Lots of 14-year-old girls and boys pretending that they're 52 on Facebook. But maybe I'm wrong.
You haven't seen my profile. I just got a question. With regard to your social games, I think even though for me it didn't come clearly that you accept that there might be some problem gambling, if I may use that word, or some addiction into it. As a social network, do you have any plans in terms of bringing awareness to your customers? Because yes, you're saying that Facebook, for example, it doesn't manufacture, but it creates the platform. But to somebody out there, they look at it and say, Facebook is giving me the games to play. And therefore, if there's any other problem, I'll blame Facebook, that I'm addicted to these games, I'm spending a lot of money, and. Do you see a need from a social point of view that you guys need to start educating, promoting that awareness, or maybe having those tools to help? Because if you look at in some jurisdictions, in terms of your casinos, they do contribute to your national responsible gambling, and because they accept the fact that you will always have those problematic customers.
So thank you for that question. And I think we are a company that's in this business for the long run. We have no ambition of creating profit in the short run by making things bad in the long run. So naturally, we want to do these things in a respectable way. We have when we did real money gambling in the UK and allowed that to happen, done a lot of consideration about how to do that in the best way. Naturally, we want to keep with the law, that's obvious, but also naturally, getting in touch with communities that are experts on, how to deal with problems around gambling and so forth. And we are, thinking continually about how we can invest in that sort of work. We think on the site that our responsibilities are mainly around the 13-year-old age verification system. It's around the 18-year-old age verification, and it's probably also about how credit cards can be used on a site. And we naturally constantly involve that process and try to make the information about this as visible and understandable to users as possible. I can go into more detail, but I think those are the things that are really on our side of things. Whereas how a game should work, how closely it should resemble a real money game or not, it's not something we are experts on and wouldn't be the right ones to address. But the other issues certainly, and we want to have an open discussion about that if people don't feel we're doing it in the right way.
It's an interesting kind of ethical, but kind of sort of a strategic discussion for Facebook. Because if you look at the businesses who provide the technology for the gaming companies, like the big software suppliers who are platform providers, they are. If you look at their valuations on the stock exchange, for example, they are valued as gaming companies. And Facebook is an element of Facebook's business is morphed into a gaming company. Anyway. Nicholas, you touched earlier on a number of regulations and laws around Europe particularly, which already apply to gambling companies, such as some of the consumer legislation, and some that don't apply to the gambling companies, like the e-commerce directive, which has gambling carved out of it. Perhaps you could just give a couple of seconds on the e-commerce directive and how it kind of works, because what I want to then discuss is with Raf and Stuart is to when people are building these games, how much of a nod do you give to consumer legislation, and how are you building your games to already encompass some of the requirements that are imposed upon you, but for gambling regulation being imposed?
Well, I think, again, relating to the newest report, we have the British OST report. What they're doing is really also looking at legislation that is already in place and that is already applicable, and kind of taking that further and saying, okay, these are the important issues, as for instance, information before a user would enter a contract, clearly depicting what the contract actually is all about. And I think that it is definitely necessary for game developers to take all that into account, just to be on the safe side, legally wise, on the safe side already today.
And just for those who haven't heard about this, so as Nicholas mentioned, the UK's Consumer Affairs Watchdog has published the results of a consultation into particularly the relationship between children and games, not gambling, just games. And they've set out a number of principles which are largely around the way in which games developers communicate with their players, communicate with the average consumer, and they've said the average consumer will often be a child, so you need to accommodate that. And I'll give you an example of how this, for people that read that and do play some of these games, or got kids that play some of these games, you'll think, crikey, this game's good, that game's bad. Someone was telling me how their child plays Temple Run, which some of you kids may play that. Temple Run has a thing where if you've inputted your password and then you input it in, say, 10 minutes later, it won't ask you to input your password, it'll just assume that you've already done it. So my friend's son bought 15 quid's worth of coins without him, and he didn't understand how it happened. So a lot of it's about communication. So from Nicholas, thank you for that. So over to Stuart, have you got any comments about how the members of your organisation, how they are building their games to accommodate the legal requirements that are already imposed upon them?
Yeah, and they have to, because it's a consumer-led industry, and those games that are the most successful are those that provide premium, engaging content, but are transparent about how you play them. They're not aggressive in their marketing. They're not aggressive in trying to take money from you at every turn. So from an association's point of view, absolutely we have a responsible view of how these games should be developed, how they should be published, how they should be marketed, and it's those companies that accept that they owe a degree of responsibility to the consumer that will ultimately succeed.
Yeah, I think there's basically 4 levels that we look at. One is basically purely common sense, and it comes back to the no horns and no hooves kind of thing. Like, just don't be evil. I mean, if you make something, just don't make something terrible or exploitative. That's one thing. Secondly, at a company level, we have our own legal counsel who helps us, gives us some guidance to make sure we don't do something naughty. Then, of course, working with the platform owners, Facebook, Apple, they also give you guidance as a developer, and also obviously they work with regulators. They also are aware of what are the best practices. So you simply, like on Apple, for example, you cannot get a game on the platform that is illegal or in breach of certain key rules. And lastly, I think, as Stuart said, at the industry level, and it's still work in progress. I don't think anybody's going to claim that everything is puppies and rainbows at this point. But I think we're working hard with the industry, with the association, to see what we can do better, where we can give better guidance to the members, to other companies.
I think it's also about giving guidance to the consumer, because actually there is a lot of protection out there already for the consumer, whether it's switching in-game purchases off for your mobile, whether it's filtering content to your laptop. And it's about educating the consumer to understand how they can mitigate the risks of their son or daughter inadvertently spending 15 quid on their credit card.
Of course, if Temple Run do it again, they'll be committing a criminal offence, so they've got to be a little bit careful themselves. So the onus will... I mean, this is the first example probably of these laws properly being applied in this environment.
And actually, the OFT's report is quite reasonable, actually, and picks up a lot of the principles that the vast majority of the industry already are putting in place.
But if you do read it, there's some pretty interesting practices. And I think one thing that's very important to keep in mind, especially as regulators, is that the people that are most likely to be doing the best job are those here on the panel. But the social ecosystem out there, the barrier to entry in social casino is so low. There are hundreds of firms out there, many of whom are not up at this table, many of whom are not members of these associations, that are in some cases doing incredibly aggressive and sometimes predatory things. So not to paint a broad brush, but we've seen, I think you're hearing from the best, I think you're hearing from the sort of people that are most likely to not try and do harm. But there's a lot of others out there that may not share that same ethic, that are just, they're going to publish a game, they're going to test it, they're going to do A/B testing, and so that game may change in an hour. And trying to keep up with some of those folks out there is incredibly difficult.
I would say 2 things. That one, that is true. Like in every industry, there are bad actors. There are people doing evil things in every industry. I would say that anyone at scale, anyone with more than a handful of users these days, is probably not one of those guys. I think the days are over that with no budget and no real company structure and 2 evil guys in a room that you can actually get to scale. I would say anyone who is a real player who actually attracts a meaningful audience would probably be not one of those guys anymore. I think those days are over, thanks to, I think, the industry, thanks to other organizations, regulators, and thanks to the platform owners as well. I think there's already been a shakeout that happened and is still happening to get rid of some of the bad actors. But still,
bearing in
more can
mind,
be done.
the industry's only 2 years old. And it's already coming together like this with its own association, with its own consumer support groups. I mean, the gambling industry probably failed to act for about 6 or 7 years before, you know, these sorts of risks were being identified. And I don't think the industry gets enough credit for that. And, you know, over time, the more people that recognise the responsibility by signing up to principles, whether they're Keith's or ours or anyone else's, the more the consumers will understand that these are the credible companies to play with, and the bad actors will slowly get, you know, forced out of the market.
Well,
but you're
but
never
how-
going to be able to eradicate it.
How will they get forced out? In the absence of regulation, and I think that's a question for you and for us. So let's say there's a bad actor out there. You know, if these principles apply, if regulators are not involved, there's no market force to move them out. So I think yes, you do get a lot of credit for being up here, you know, for taking some punches. But, you know, our concerns are not, we have to have the totality of concern. And I don't see a mechanism for, any easy mechanism for addressing the black hat side.
Well, Mark, I think you had a question.
This is a question, I should imagine it goes to Stuart and Raf first. I'd be interested in Keith's take on it. Am I correct in thinking that social gambling games monetize more rapidly and are stickier in terms of their longevity than simulation games or card games, etc.? Have I understood that correctly?
Yeah, that's correct. I think they're not best in class in terms of monetization. I think the more hardcore or mid-core games tend to monetize better, like your strategy games, like there's this famous Puzzles and Dragons from a Japanese company. I would say the casino-style games are probably towards in the middle of the pack. They're obviously monetizing better than your really casual games, but they're not up there with the best of the most.
And in terms of consumer loyalty, so do you see the same person coming back to that game, or do you see that when the latest simulation game comes out, does it cannibalize the gambling crowd? Do you know enough about that?
Yeah, so it depends a little bit, because in the end it comes down to, is it a good game or not? If you have even if you make a casino game, a slot game, a poker game, whatnot, if the game is not really good enough, if it's not fun, people will not come back. So I think it's very hard to say generically. I think the better games out there do retain their users for a very long time, in the same way that a really good casual game also does the same. Like, it's not really, I think the retention lines are not really all about the categories, but about the quality of the games.
And I think that's my question to Keith. Do you think there's something about gambling which has endured over the centuries, which is specific to those games, which attracts a particular kind of mindset?
Yeah, I think it's a testable proposition. So I think there is some overlap among those who have a propensity to gamble a lot, who have a propensity to have a gambling addiction. Yes, there is probably some commonality. I think on the recreational side, on the social side, probably not. So yeah, that's a question that we, with research, we could probably pretty easily address and find that out. And I think we're on the cusp of it. I mean, I think we're certainly looking at that. And even if it is true, the response is certainly not to abolish social casino, but the response is to say, okay, then let's see how do we minimize that risk across all platforms, because again, we are not platform specific, and I think that's one of the concerns when we place gaming in these little boxes. Online is different than mobile, which is different from bingo. Technology blurs all this together. And so from our standpoint, from reducing risk for the user across any platform, it's going to demand a much more broad spectrum approach. And that I think by trying to narrow it down and say, is social casino more addictive or more addictive for some people, we miss the broader point, which in some cases takes this away from, again, a regulatory approach and more to consumer protection, a general public health approach, less industry segment specific, and more about, are we doing a good enough job at educating youth in general how to take risk appropriately? And I think that's where we work with people like Facebook and others, not sort of specific operators like Raf.
Yeah. There's also one interesting thing actually what we've seen, and it's quite anecdotal, so I'm not going to say that this is widespread, but we actually have seen that a lot of people who used to play slots specifically for real money actually started moving towards the free-to-play games, specifically like the more leisure end of the market, not the people who really are chasing the jackpots, but the people who are kind of maximizing for time. The people you will see, like if you walk during the daytime in a Vegas casino, people actually they know they have $50 to spend and they want to have as much time as possible for their $50. Those people are actually migrating to freemium games because they actually get more value for money, because for their $50 they can spend a full month playing our game versus maybe 2 or 3 hours in Vegas if they're lucky.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Keith, we do know that among alcohol dependency people, there's a higher prevalence of Coca-Cola drinking. And we also do know that PepsiCo has some alcoholic beverage out there. Now, it's not because Pepsi sells alcoholic beverage that we ask to regulate the sale of soft drinks. And it's not because alcohol dependency people drink more soft drinks that we start to do prevention with soft drinks. So I'm wondering, why is it so different between drinking and gambling? And why do we not have the same standards for those two substances? Keeping in mind, of course, that there's much more problems with alcohol consumption than gambling.
Okay, well, I'm not entirely sure I follow that logic, but I guess the point is, why not? If we can prevent harm in even one, what is the point in not trying? Why don't we use this technology to try and do good things as well? I mean, I think we limit ourselves by saying, oh, forget about it. It would be too hard to do, or there's precedent, people spend too much on the ballet. I could care less. My point is that we know there are risks to gambling. I think we can make a case that there's at least an association with addiction and with social, and that the more we can do to mitigate it, the better off we are. And I see it costing little or nothing. I think the cost of not doing something could be problematic for at least some people, and the cost of doing something are infinitesimal. So I guess my response would be, yeah, why not? Let's spin it on. What's the rationale not to have as good consumer protection as we can?
Any more questions? Very interested to hear people's views. I mean, you've lots of regulators from all around the world, different laws, different approaches to these things. A number of regulators and a number of jurisdictions haven't considered the regulation of online, let alone the regulation of social. So if you have any views on whether the kind of products we're talking about would fall within your remit or whether they wouldn't, I'd be very interested to hear that, because going back to what Nicholas was saying at the very, very beginning, we were talking about the kind of the holy trinity of consideration, chance, and prize. I remember when we first started looking at the law of social, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, when people were asking us, okay, what are the laws around the world for this particular kind of model that we all now understand and we all know very well, and the inability to extract any value from the environment meant, other than a couple of quirky places where it wasn't quite sure, you could argue that it wasn't gambling at all. Now, the obvious next question is the definition of gambling in all the legislation up to date?
Yeah.
Because when you look at the way in which people interact with gaming environments, people interact with each other, the way in which players behave, and I mean, you guys will know more about this than anyone in the room probably, the way it has fundamentally changed. The idea that I would, and we were talking about this over breakfast, the idea that I might go onto an online casino and play slots 3 times a day for 10 minutes may be a concern. If I go onto a social slot game and I play for 3 times for 10 minutes every day, is that the same concern? I don't have the answer to that. That's a question for you guys.
That's why the legal definitions are irrelevant, because ultimately the industry will lose the battle if it tries to argue it's not gambling, because the regulators will just change their legislation and we've achieved nothing. So it's about the underlying consumer protection, and it's about, going back to Nicholas's point about the research, it is a different consumer. The behaviours and the psychologies aren't the same. For someone to go and play a slots knowing that they're going to win nothing is a completely different mindset to someone who's going to put money in a machine knowing that they may have a chance of winning something. So it's about research, understanding the behaviours, then understanding the risks, and then understanding what you can do to mitigate them.
Also, I think it's really important, and especially if you're interested in this, I would suggest you to actually play some of the games, ideally ours, but there's also others. Because I think they are also quite different, because obviously there are slots and there's bingo and there's poker, and the core mechanic is obviously those slots and the actual bingo mechanics and so on, but there is much more to it actually. Otherwise, it would be hard to get people to come back 3 times a day for 10 minutes, because it doesn't really make that much sense. So what most quality game studios do is actually add more features to it. So the slots are one of the elements, one of the important elements of the game, but there's so much more. Like if you play Slotomania, which is actually the leading slots game on Facebook, you will actually see that the real drive is actually to keep unlocking new content. The actual core gameplay mechanic is actually unlocking more and more content, discovering new worlds, new teams, and so on. And you play the slots to actually get there, to collect more and more points to get to the next level. In our game, in Mirabal Slots, we have a similar mechanic. It's a collection mechanic. You actually collect symbols in each game, themed symbols, that actually give you extra coins. The game itself is obviously you still play slots games, but there is a purpose, there's a persistent feature that you can't really get in real money casino, in real money gambling, because the math doesn't work, the economy doesn't work. And that actually, those features are what make the game fun and engaging, above and beyond the actual casino or the gambling.
Average cost per hour on a game.
So if a slot within a land-based casino and a slot within Facebook environment are fundamentally built in a completely different way, insofar as, you know, I might go to a casino for various reasons. I might come to your site because it's entertaining in a different way, but it's entertaining. And I'm there not to win any money, obviously, and it may just entertain me for 10 minutes. The question I've got for you, Keith, is then, is the comparisons that you have not made, but you've said could be made, and others have said are to be made, between those two environments, are they really fair? And you made the answer that way, we don't know yet. But I'm interested to understand, with your expertise and anybody else's expertise in the room, where are the similarities there? What elements of social gaming that could lead to issues are also present in the real land-based or online real money environment?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a vast overlap. I thought Nicholas's slide was great, where it showed that the two slot games that look 99% identical, right? I mean, they're almost impossible to tell apart. Yet, as we know very well, the mechanics underlying those games are as fundamentally different as they could be. And I think one thing is, one of our concerns about convergence was, let's say you have a player, and I'll use Nicholas's term, that's been groomed into expecting that this game performs and acts in a manner that they've been playing it on the social side, which is incredibly high rewards, all this. They move to an RMG site without much warning. You know, they haven't done, I mean, they've monetized, but maybe they haven't done a lot of, there's not a lot of notice there, or they come upon this game in some other venue, and all of a sudden, the mechanics are utterly and completely different. And so I think that's one of the risks there. I think the other thing is that,
sorry, can I just stop you there? I mean, this is
sure,
sort of the point I keep adding. So people have heard me speak before might have heard this example, but I always wonder if this is a concern. If people say like, yeah, but the mechanics in your social free-to-play casino games are not exactly the same as in real money gambling. That's a big concern. So why is no one ever saying like the braking distance in a racing game are not exactly the same as in a real car? So obviously this is a big problem, because if people play your racing game on their Xbox, they're gonna expect that the car accelerates at a certain pace and it can brake in a certain pace, and then I buy my real car and I die. You're to blame, game studio.
Well, I think the way to address that is simply inform the consumer. You know, more transparency in how the games work, regardless of platform, goes a long way. But I mean, that's an absolutely apt point. I mean, I think one of the standards, one of the bloggers in this field that many of us know, said the test of whether a game is sort of gambling related or not is, can you enjoy it to its fullest without monetizing? And I think for probably a lot of the games that you have and that your people represent, the answer is likely yes. But I think the more the enjoyment of the game, or the point of the game is monetization, the more it becomes closer to the types of things that we're probably concerned about. But so other features, I mean, and there are a lot of other features that I think are things that cannot be found or have been regulated out in the real world. Near-miss features, for example. You know, we know that we can do lots of things on a social setting, and maybe you don't, but others do, that we know in the real money world are linked to addiction and linked to problems that have been regulated, such as a near-miss feature. You know, I know of no one. I think there's a lot of things that we see online. Aggressive pursuit of players. So I've signed up for a number of these games. I play a number of these games, and I'm constantly being bombarded by inducements to come back. Please come back. 50 extra credits, 100 extra credits. You know, and so I think if I was a recovering gambler and I was trying to stay away, that aggressive pursuit online that you don't see in the traditional casino setting, and that is a feature of social, and that's a fine feature of social, again, for recreational players. But if for a player with a problem, without mechanisms for that player with a problem to say, maybe I have had a gambling problem in the casino, I've signed up for your social site, I found that's a problem for me too, please, you know.
But in the way that online, then there would be some responsibilities imposed upon the operator to deal with that kind of thing.
Yeah.
In social, there isn't.
Right.
And yet, are you at all building your games to accommodate those concerns? I mean, because I'm very interested in what Stuart was saying about the relative unimportance, perhaps, of the gambling definition, and what's more important at the moment. And I think the OFT's thing is quite clear that it's other laws. There are other interested parties now. It's not just the gambling regulators that are very interested in what you guys are doing. So, I mean, there does feel, and I think you guys have said it before, there does feel to be a bit of a opportunity for you guys to nip some of this in the bud by acting in the right way. Now, you may have others that don't, and that's up for the regulators, the Consumer Affairs Agency, whoever they happen to be, to do something about that. But are you alive to the responsibility, and how are you building your games to cope with these accusations?
It's not easy, and I think for us specifically, and I can only speak for my company and not for anyone else in the industry, I think it's a very manual process at this point. We had a couple of people who asked to be excluded because they did spend too much time or too much money, and they felt that they struggled to control themselves, and they asked us to intervene on their behalf, and we do that. But it's a manual process. We haven't built technology that does that. We haven't built technology to monitor specific behavior. So we follow, obviously, our CRM team and our customer service team follows.
But you must analyze players to death. You must know exactly what they do, don't you? I mean,
yeah, but it's hard for me to intervene based on what I see. Like it's hard for me to call someone and say, like, actually, I've been following you for a bit. I think you're spending a bit too much money here. It's not up to me to step in. Like what we do is basically where we follow what we call the whales, the high spenders. We actually follow our top spenders to the very minimum, monitor them to understand what these people are doing, because they do actually represent a meaningful percentage of the revenue. Well, what we do see, and I worked in online gambling before, I'm not an expert like he, but what we do see is that their spending behavior doesn't feel like something we should be overly concerned about. What we typically see in online gambling, for example, problematic behavior is people going crescendo, where they start with $50, $100, $200, $300, $500, and they keep spending more and more in a shorter period of time. What we see with most of our whales is quite disciplined behavior. People spend once, twice, 3 times a week, and usually the same amount or a similar amount. So people who do spend a couple of $100 per month, it doesn't seem to escalate. It doesn't feel that those people are out of control. It does feel, at least from what I see and what I know, that all of these people pretty much are under control and are fairly disciplined in their spending behavior. But there are exceptions, and it's hard for us to intervene. It is definitely an area that might need more a closer look. I think right now most responsible companies try to have some internal process, but it's a very manual and very ad hoc process.
So perhaps one comment from me here, and I mean, we've talked a lot about transparency, we've talked about information to consumers. And I think we can even go a step further. We can talk about consumer empowerment, frankly. And that is certainly something that platform operators have in their interest to empower the consumers to control some of this behavior. We have it on our site. Other operators have implemented differently. But where you are in control of what sort of information do you actually want to receive? Do you want to be nagged all the time? Do you want to see what games your friends play? How do you want to set your settings up for that? And I think there's you know, we've done a lot. There's probably more we can do, but I think, you know, it's one important thing is information. Yes, certainly, but there are lots of things we can do to actually empower the consumer to control what they like and don't like.
And just to your point about being alive to the problem, I mean, the industry is absolutely alive to the problem, and it's not just in relation to gambling-style games, it's to the industry generally. I mean, as an association, we're engaging with the UK Gambling Commission. We've provided and put into the OFT report. We're lobbying in Australia, in France, in Belgium, and we are actively dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. And I think the biggest problem at the moment is that we're fighting battles on a number of different grounds because everyone wants to take a piece of control, and we haven't yet established who is the right person to take that control.
I do think the industry's moved on a bit from just the retort, which it was about a year ago, would say, well, we're not gambling, we're just entertainment.
Yes.
I mean, entertainment is itself subject to a number of laws and regulations, so you know, it doesn't mean it's the Wild West necessarily. I think we're pretty much running out of time, so I've been told we've run out of time. Anyway, so thank you very much to the panel. They're absolutely terrific. Thank you.
Thanks to the panel, thanks to Stephen for organizing this. It was kind of nerve-wracking because of all the microphones, but it was a really good dialogue, a good discussion, and thanks for questions from the audience. I would like to give you this as a memory. We are getting closer to the closing session. I'd like to remind you about this survey. There's a nice woman in the back with yellow trousers. She would like them back from Quebec. Hello. So now, it's the end of the conference. So I would like to welcome Susan Hensel for the closing session. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that concludes an interesting and informative formal conference program. Over the past 2 days, we've covered a lot of territory. We've heard multiple sessions raising issues concerning the challenges that both we and operators are facing and will be facing in the future. A lot of it due to the rapid changes we're seeing in technology. We've explored solutions for problem gaming. We've gained insight into how operators regard regulators, and we just heard an excellent discussion on social gaming. We also enjoyed targeted breakout sessions on topics ranging from match fixings to auditing, and it has certainly been a timely and thought-provoking 2 days. And we're not done yet. We still have some networking activities that I know I'm looking forward to, and they start tonight. So with that, let's conclude our formal portion of the conference program, and please join me in giving a hand of applause to both Atlee and to the Norwegian Gaming and Foundation Authority for the absolutely excellent job they did in putting this program together for us.